The screen bursts open with the thunder of cannon fire, the crackle of muskets, and the roar of soldiers charging into chaos. Smoke chokes the air. Flags ripple through clouds of gunpowder. The ground shakes beneath the weight of thousands of boots and hooves. This isn't a movie. This was reality for hundreds of thousands of Americans during the Civil War. Voiceover cuts in over rapid flashes of battlefield scenes. Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, Fredericksburg, each more brutal than the last. These weren't just military clashes. They were slaughterhouses, some of the bloodiest days in American history. But what made them so horrific? Was it the outdated tactics in an age of modern weapons? The sheer number of soldiers thrown into hopeless assaults? Or was it something even darker, a glimpse into how far a nation will go when it's at war? With itself. These battles left behind more than just bodies. They carved deep scars into the American landscape and psyche. They turned farms into graveyards and rivers into bloodstreams. And more than 150 years later, they still haunt our national memory. This video takes you beyond the textbooks, into the mud, the fear, the fire. We'll break down the most brutal battles of the Civil War, why they happened the way they did, and what they cost in blood, lives, and legacy. Stick around, hit subscribe, and step into the heart of America's deadliest conflict, where every cannon blast echoes through time. The American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, was a cataclysm unlike anything the nation had ever seen. It erupted when deep-rooted tensions over slavery, states' rights, and federal power finally reached a boiling point. 11 Southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederacy, while the remaining states fought to preserve the nation. What began as a political and ideological clash quickly spiraled into a devastating military conflict that tore families apart and turned fields, forests, and towns into battlegrounds. This was not a distant war fought overseas. It happened on American soil, between neighbors, between brothers. The scale of death was staggering. By the time it ended, somewhere between 620,000 and 750,000 Americans were dead, more than in all other U.S. wars combined. Disease, infection, and primitive medical care played a role, but it was the sheer brutality of the battles themselves that defined the horror of the Civil War. This video isn't just about dates and tactics. It's about the reality of war at its most savage. We'll dive into the deadliest and most harrowing battles of the conflict. What actually happened on those blood-soaked fields? Why were these battles so devastating? And how did they shape not only the outcome of the war, but the soul of a nation? From the sun-scorched plains of Shiloh to the scorched hills of Gettysburg, we'll walk through the most infamous clashes, the moments where strategy failed, humanity cracked, and history was written in blood. This is the story of how the Civil War earned its place as one of the most brutal chapters in American memory. September 17, 1862, Antietam Creek, near Sharpsburg, Maryland. What began as a foggy morning quickly descended into one of the bloodiest and most chaotic days in American history. By sundown, over 23,000 men lay dead, wounded, or missing. The Battle of Antietam was not just the bloodiest single day of the Civil War. It remains the bloodiest single day in all of American military history. The fighting erupted at dawn, as Union General George B. McClellan launched a massive assault against Confederate forces under General Robert E. Lee. Lee had brought his Army of Northern Virginia into the North, hoping a victory on Union soil would sway foreign powers and pressure the North into peace talks. But McClellan had a rare advantage. He had intercepted Lee's battle plans days earlier. Despite this, the battle quickly became a brutal slugfest with no clear command of momentum. The opening phase took place in a 30-acre cornfield that would soon become infamous, simply known as the cornfield. At first light, Union troops surged through the dense stalks, only to be mowed down by well-positioned Confederate infantry. Waves of reinforcements on both sides crashed into each other in a scene of utter madness. Soldiers later described the corn being cut down by bullets as if by a scythe. The ground turned into a killing zone, with control of the field changing hands multiple times within a few hours. Blood soaked the soil so thoroughly that, according to one officer, it was impossible to walk without stepping on the wounded or the dead. As the morning carnage settled, the focus shifted to a sunken farm road that would earn the grim nickname Bloody Lane. Confederate forces dug into this natural trench, repelled repeated Union assaults. The lane became a death trap, a funnel of fire. For hours, Union troops were cut down as they charged the narrow approach, stacking bodies atop one another. Eventually, a flanking maneuver broke the line, and the road filled with the dead, packed shoulder to shoulder in the trench. It was said the blood ran in rivulets down the path, staining the dirt for days. Later in the day, the battle reached its final act at Burnside's Bridge. Union troops under General Ambrose Burnside attempted to cross a narrow stone bridge over Antietam Creek, which was fiercely defended by a small number of Georgians on the high bluffs. For hours, the Union assault was stalled, with soldiers packed tight on the bridge under withering fire. Despite outnumbering the defenders, Burnside's forces struggled to coordinate their attacks. Only after a costly delay did they finally secure the crossing, just as fresh Confederate reinforcements arrived and drove them back. The chance to end the battle with a decisive blow slipped away. By nightfall, the battlefield was a shattered landscape of corpses, twisted metal, and wounded men crying out for water. No side could claim a clear tactical victory. Lee held the field briefly but was forced to retreat the next day back into Virginia. McClellan, as usual, hesitated to pursue. But strategically, Antietam was a turning point. It halted Lee's first invasion of the North and gave President Lincoln the political momentum he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation just days later. The impact of that one day rippled across the world. With the Union's show of strength, Britain and France backed away from recognizing the Confederacy. The war, which had been fought to preserve the Union, was now also a war to end slavery. And the staggering cost, 23,000 casualties in just 12 hours, shocked the American public. Newspapers published harrowing illustrations and first-hand accounts. Photography brought the battlefield's horrors into people's homes for the first time. Antietam wasn't just a military engagement, it was a national trauma. Maps, reenactments, and historical illustrations help bring these scenes to life. The twisted shapes in the cornfield, the corpse-choked Bloody Lane, the desperate charge at Burnside's Bridge. These images show the price of war not in glory, but in blood. Antietam marked a grim evolution, a moment when the Civil War shed its early illusions and revealed its full, brutal nature. July 1863. The hills of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a quiet farming town that would become the site of the most iconic and devastating battle of the Civil War. Over the course of 3 relentless days, from July 1st to 3rd, Union and Confederate forces clashed in a thunderous confrontation that left roughly 51,000 soldiers dead, wounded, or missing. It wasn't just the largest battle of the war. It was the turning point, the moment the tide began to shift irreversibly against the Confederacy. It began when Confederate troops led by General Robert E. Lee pushed into Pennsylvania as part of his second and most ambitious invasion of the North. Lee believed a victory on Union soil would demoralize the North, push foreign powers to recognize the Confederacy, and possibly force a peace settlement. But what started as a search for supplies spiraled into full-scale combat when Confederate troops encountered Union cavalry just outside Gettysburg. Day 1 saw the Confederates push the Union forces back through the town, forcing them to regroup on the high ground south of Gettysburg. By the evening, the Union Army had formed a strong defensive position along a fishhook-shaped line on Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and the rocky heights of Culp's Hill and Little Round Top. Day 2 escalated into some of the fiercest fighting of the war. Lee ordered attacks on both Union flanks, hoping to break their line. At Little Round Top, Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain and his 20th Maine Regiment held a crucial position on the Union left. Outnumbered and running low on ammunition, they executed a daring bayonet charge that stunned Confederate forces and saved the flank from collapse. On the right, Union troops fought a brutal, confusing nighttime battle on Culp's Hill, with men fighting in dense woods under musket flashes and shouted orders. But it was the 3rd day that sealed Gettysburg's legacy and its horror. Convinced the center of the Union line was vulnerable, Lee ordered a massive frontal assault on Cemetery Ridge. Around 12,500 Confederate soldiers, led by General George Pickett, stepped out from the tree line and began a mile-long march across open fields, an event forever known as Pickett's Charge. But it was the third day that sealed Gettysburg's legacy and its horror. Convinced the center of the Union line was vulnerable, Lee ordered a massive frontal assault on Cemetery Ridge. Around 12,500 Confederate soldiers, led by General George Pickett, stepped out from the tree line and began a mile-long march across open fields, an event forever known as Pickett's Charge. What followed was pure carnage. Union artillery and rifle fire tore through the advancing lines. Soldiers fell in waves, but the Confederates pressed on, reaching the Union line only to be driven back in hand-to-hand combat. Within an hour, thousands were dead or wounded. Entire regiments ceased to exist. One Confederate survivor would later call it a complete and utter slaughter. Lee, devastated, took full responsibility for the failure, telling Pickett, "It is all my fault." The human toll was almost beyond comprehension. Over 7,000 men killed outright, tens of thousands wounded, many left to suffer for days in the July heat before aid could reach them. The bodies of men and horses were piled in fields, the stench of death hanging over the town for weeks. Civilians, including women and children, were forced to shelter in cellars as the sounds of war thundered overhead. Some homes were turned into makeshift hospitals. Families in Gettysburg found their yards filled with the dead and dying, their lives forever altered by the battle on their doorstep. And yet, even in the aftermath of so much suffering, Gettysburg gave birth to one of the most enduring moments in American history. 4 months after the battle, President Abraham Lincoln stood on that hallowed ground and delivered a speech just over 2 minutes long, the Gettysburg Address. In those few words, he reframed the purpose of the war. It was no longer just a fight to preserve the Union, but a struggle to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Gettysburg was a turning point not just militarily, but symbolically. Lee's army would never again launch an offensive on Union soil. The Confederacy was forced into a defensive war of attrition it could not win. More importantly, the immense sacrifice at Gettysburg reminded the North and the world that the cost of this war was too high to turn back. The fields of Pennsylvania had soaked up the blood of tens of thousands, and with it, the determination to see the war through to its end had only grown stronger. The images of Gettysburg, the long lines of cannon, the shattered fences of the battlefield, the somber rows of headstones in the aftermath, remain etched into the collective memory of the United States. It was more than a military engagement. It was a reckoning. A reminder that freedom and unity, once taken for granted, must sometimes be paid for in the highest possible terms. April 1862. The war was still young, and many on both sides believed it would be over quickly, a few battles, some posturing, and then a negotiated peace. That illusion shattered at a place called Shiloh, near the Tennessee River, where the war revealed its true, brutal nature. In just 2 days of savage fighting, over 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or went missing, a death toll that stunned the nation and forever changed the way Americans viewed the conflict. The Battle of Shiloh began at dawn on April 6, 1862. Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant were camped near a small church called Shiloh Meeting House, unaware that a large Confederate army under General Albert Sidney Johnston was moving toward them through the woods. At first light, the Confederates launched a surprise attack, catching many Union soldiers still cooking breakfast or asleep in their tents. Chaos erupted. The sound of musket fire and artillery thundered through the forest, shattering the early morning calm. What followed was one of the most disorganized and ferocious battles of the entire war. The dense terrain made communication nearly impossible. Smoke from thousands of rifles and cannons hung thick in the air. Units became separated, officers were killed, and soldiers fought in confusion, often unaware of where the front line even was. One Confederate soldier described it as, like fighting in a nightmare. The Confederates pushed the Union back throughout the day, capturing ground and inflicting heavy casualties. By afternoon, they had driven the Union troops toward the Tennessee River, threatening to trap them completely. But during the intense assault, General Johnston, the highest-ranking Confederate officer to die in the war, was mortally wounded. His death dealt a serious blow to Confederate morale and command structure. As night fell, the battlefield was a hellscape. Rain began to pour. The wounded lay crying out in the mud, while wild hogs roamed the field scavenging the dead. Soldiers described the night as filled with groans, thunder, and the flicker of lightning revealing the carnage around them. Some wounded men drowned in the mud. Others lay for hours, unable to move, as the rain soaked their uniforms and chilled their bodies. Overnight, Union reinforcements arrived, and on April 7th, Grant launched a counterattack. The tide turned. The Confederates, exhausted and disorganized, were pushed back. By the end of the second day, it was clear. The Union had held the field, but at an unimaginable cost. No one was prepared for the numbers. Over 13,000 Union casualties, nearly 11,000 Confederate. Before Shiloh, the worst battle Americans had experienced was probably in the Mexican-American War, where the death tolls rarely exceeded a few hundred. Now, in 2 days, entire regiments had been obliterated. Communities back home were stunned as casualty lists were published. It was a wake-up call. The war would be longer, bloodier, and more devastating than anyone had imagined. Key figures emerged from the carnage. Ulysses S. Grant, despite being criticized for being caught off guard, proved his resilience and determination. He didn't retreat, he didn't panic, he fought back. This battle cemented his reputation as a relentless leader, someone who would endure hardship and continue to press forward. Meanwhile, the loss of Albert Sidney Johnston was a severe blow to the Confederate command. Jefferson Davis had considered him one of the South's most capable generals. His death left a leadership gap that was never quite filled. Shiloh also forced both armies to reconsider how they fought. The scale of the battle made it clear that this wasn't a conflict of militia skirmishes or romantic charges. This was industrial warfare, mass mobilization, brutal firepower, and grinding. Attrition. The soldiers who survived Shiloh understood that the war ahead would be anything but glorious. It would be about survival, endurance, and blood. Visually, Shiloh offers stark contrast. The quiet woods, the muddy fields, the simple log church that gave the battle its name, all turned into scenes of unspeakable violence. The name Shiloh ironically means place of peace in Hebrew, but for those who fought there, it became synonymous with the end of innocence, a baptism of fire in a war that would only grow more horrifying. December 1862. Winter settled over Virginia as the Union Army prepared for one of the most ill-fated assaults of the entire Civil War, the Battle of Fredericksburg. It was a 5-day bloodbath marked by tactical blunders, poor leadership, and one of the most lopsided defeats the Union would ever suffer. By the end, nearly 18,000 men had been killed, wounded, or gone missing, many falling in waves beneath Confederate guns in what came to be seen as nothing short of a slaughter. The battle began on December 11th, when Union engineers attempted to build pontoon bridges across the Rappahannock River under Confederate fire to allow their army, nearly 120,000 strong, to cross into Fredericksburg. Snipers from buildings and windows harassed the builders, turning the riverfront into a deadly gauntlet. Eventually, Union troops stormed the town itself, engaging in brutal house-to-house fighting, a rare scene of urban combat in the Civil War, but the true horror was yet to come. On December 13th, Union General Ambrose Burnside ordered repeated frontal assaults against the Confederate Army, which was entrenched in near-impregnable positions on the high ground west of town, particularly a ridge known as Mary's Heights. Confederate troops, under the command of General Robert E. Lee, and with artillery placed perfectly along a stone wall at the base of the ridge, had a clear and devastating view of the open plain Union troops had to cross. What followed was one of the most futile and tragic episodes of the entire war. Wave after wave of Union soldiers, brigades lined up shoulder to shoulder, advanced across open ground, only to be mowed down by Confederate musket and cannon fire. The soldiers never had a chance. Some units were annihilated within minutes of leaving cover. The bodies piled up in front of the stone wall, hundreds, then thousands, as more men were ordered to advance. A Confederate soldier recalled watching the slaughter and later said, "It was butchery, not battle." At Mary's Heights, the battlefield became a killing field. The Union attacks were so predictably doomed that Confederate troops eventually stopped firing between charges, simply waiting for the next group to appear. As the day wore on, Snow began to fall, covering the blood-soaked ground and the still bodies of the fallen. The cries of the wounded, trapped between the lines, echoed into the night. Some lay for hours or days before being rescued or succumbing to their injuries. The senselessness of it all was magnified by the indecision and arrogance of Union leadership. General Burnside, under immense political pressure to deliver a victory, ignored his subordinates' warnings and continued the attacks long after it was clear they were hopeless. His failure wasn't just tactical, it was moral. Soldiers and officers alike questioned why men were being sent to die in such a clearly unwinnable situation. Historian Shelby Foote later said that Fredericksburg was not a battle, but a demonstration of the power of stupidity in high places. On the Confederate side, the view from the ridge was grimly victorious. General James Longstreet, watching the devastation unfold from Marye's Heights, reportedly said, "It is well that war is so terrible, lest we grow too fond of it." Lee himself, despite the overwhelming win, was somber. He knew the Union would be back, and that the war's worst was still ahead. Fredericksburg had little strategic value, but its psychological impact was enormous. Northern morale plummeted. Newspapers denounced the leadership. Soldiers who had survived the carnage returned disillusioned and angry. For many, Fredericksburg marked the moment the war lost any last trace of romanticism. It became something darker, a conflict that devoured men without mercy. The snow-covered fields of Fredericksburg, littered with the frozen bodies of the Union dead, became a haunting symbol of everything wrong with war: the cost of arrogance, the blindness of command, and the tragic waste of human life in the pursuit of misguided glory. By mid-1864, the Civil War had become a war of exhaustion, of supplies, manpower, and willpower. Nowhere was this more evident than at the Siege of Petersburg, a grueling, nearly 10-month campaign that stretched from June 1864 to April 1865. Fought just south of the Confederate capital of Richmond, Petersburg wasn't a single battle. It was a drawn-out, punishing stalemate that changed the nature of warfare and broke the spirit of a nation already stretched thin. Union General Ulysses S. Grant, now leading the Army of the Potomac, had one goal: destroy General Robert E. Lee's army and cut off vital Confederate supply lines. Petersburg was a crucial railway hub. If Grant could take it, he could strangle the Confederacy's ability to move food, troops, and weapons. But Lee, understanding its strategic importance, rushed to defend it. What followed was not the dramatic charges and sweeping maneuvers that had defined earlier battles. It was something darker, slower, and far more brutal. The Union and Confederate armies dug in, literally. Both sides constructed miles of trenches, creating a hellish landscape of mud, rats, disease, and constant fear. Soldiers lived in cramped, filthy conditions, dodging sniper fire and artillery barrages day and night. These trenches, some stretching for over 30 miles, foreshadowed the horrors of World War I, decades before it would arrive. The earth itself became the battlefield, riddled with tunnels, fortified with sandbags and timber, soaked in blood. One of the most infamous episodes of the siege was the Battle of the Crater. In late July 1864, Union troops, led by a regiment of Pennsylvania coal miners, dug a massive tunnel under the Confederate lines and packed it with explosives. On July 30th, they detonated it. The blast created a crater 170 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 30 feet deep, killing hundreds of Confederate soldiers instantly. But what began as a tactical advantage quickly turned into a nightmare. Union commanders botched the follow-up attack. Instead of moving around the crater, many soldiers charged directly into it, only to find themselves trapped in a pit of death. Confederate troops regrouped and fired down into the hole, slaughtering the Union forces below. What should have been a breakthrough turned into a massacre, with nearly 4,000 Union casualties in just a few hours. It was a devastating reminder of the cost of poor planning and the unforgiving nature of siege warfare. For both soldiers and civilians, the siege brought relentless psychological torment. Confederate troops, increasingly undersupplied and outnumbered, held the lines under deteriorating conditions. Food was scarce, disease spread quickly, morale plunged. In Richmond and Petersburg, civilians endured constant shelling and starvation, watching their cities crumble and their sons disappear into the trenches. For the Union troops, the slow grind was maddening, each day a test of survival more than strategy. As months dragged on, Lee's army thinned. Desertions increased. Supplies ran dangerously low. Meanwhile, Grant, with greater numbers and resources, slowly tightened the noose. By April 1865, Lee's lines finally broke. He ordered a retreat, knowing it was over. Just days later, on April 9th, he surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Civil War. The Siege of Petersburg wasn't a singular moment of glory. It was a long, excruciating lesson in the cost of attrition. It signaled a transformation in warfare itself, revealing that future conflicts would not be won by valor alone, but by industry, logistics, and the ability to endure. In the mud of Petersburg's trenches, the war lost its last vestiges of romanticism. There were no sweeping charges here, no stirring speeches, only silence, smoke, and the slow, grinding machinery of death. It was where the Confederacy's back was finally broken, not by one final blow, but by 1,000 cuts that never stopped. Bleeding. What made these Civil War battles so uniquely brutal wasn't just the sheer numbers. It was how strategy, technology, and desperation collided in the worst ways possible. By the 1860s, military technology had advanced far beyond the tactics being used. The standard approach to battle still relied on Napoleonic-era formations, long lines of infantry advancing in close ranks, shoulder to shoulder. This style of fighting was meant for smoothbore muskets, which were inaccurate and had a short range. But now, rifles like the Springfield Model 1861 were far more accurate and deadly at longer distances. Add to that the widespread use of artillery, canister shot, and repeating firearms in some cases, and you had mass slaughter on an industrial scale, especially when men were sent charging across open fields into entrenched enemy fire. The lack of medical understanding only compounded the horror. A soldier wounded in battle had a greater chance of dying from infection than from the injury itself. Antiseptics weren't widely used, and germ theory was still not widely accepted. Amputations were common, performed in unsanitary conditions, often without anesthesia, and sometimes with unsterilized tools. Hospitals were overwhelmed and unprepared. Surgeons worked for hours on end, sometimes stacking limbs outside their tents. Letters from doctors describe the groans of the wounded, the blood-soaked floors, and the overwhelming smell of death. Then there was the political pressure. Both the Union and the Confederacy needed victories, not just for military gain, but for morale. In the North, President Lincoln faced intense scrutiny and opposition. A string of Union defeats could have cost him re-election. In the South, Confederate leaders needed to show strength to maintain the loyalty of the states and keep foreign powers watching with interest. Commanders were often pushed into offensive actions that made little strategic sense, simply to prove they could win, or to avoid appearing weak. That urgency led to aggressive maneuvers and high-risk decisions that resulted in massive casualties. But behind the statistics and strategies were the voices of the men who lived and died through it all. In letters home, soldiers spoke of fear, longing, and resignation. One Union soldier wrote, "I go where I am ordered, but I pray every night that this madness will end." Confederate troops, too, revealed the toll, hunger, fatigue, the ache of missing loved ones. Some diary entries speak of comrades dying in their arms, of carrying wounded friends across blood-soaked ground, of burying brothers in shallow graves, before marching on. Surgeons scribbled grim notes in field journals, cases they couldn't save, limbs they had to remove, the helplessness they felt in the face of overwhelming numbers. One described operating for 30 hours straight, without food or rest. "They kept coming," he wrote, "and there was no end to the suffering." These were battles fought not only with bullets, but with desperation, fear, and raw human endurance. They were brutal because they were waged in an age caught between old ways and new realities, when honor and duty met rifled muskets and ironclad war machines. And through it all, it was ordinary people, farmers, clerks, immigrants, sons, who paid the highest price. In understanding why these battles were so devastating, we see more than tactics and politics. We see the human cost of war when the world changes faster than people can adapt, and we see the echoes of that trauma in every muddy trench and blood-stained field that still dots the American landscape. As the dust settled and the war finally ended, the human cost of the Civil War left a permanent scar on the nation. Over 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers, both Union and Confederate, lost their lives in those brutal battles. When we reflect on these staggering numbers, we realize that the true impact wasn't just the military strategy, but the deep personal loss experienced by families across the country. Sons, brothers, and fathers never returned. And the echoes of their sacrifice are still felt today. These battles, though horrific, became defining moments in American history. They helped forge a national identity out of a fractured nation. The horrors of Antietam, Gettysburg, Shiloh, Fredericksburg, and Petersburg were part of a brutal struggle not just for the future of slavery, but for the soul of the United States. They were battles for unity, for freedom, and for the very principles upon which the nation was built. But the cost didn't end with the war. The way these battles were remembered and the stories we tell about them helped shape the collective memory of the Civil War. In the years that followed, both North and South grappled with how to honor the dead, the survivors, and the lessons learned from such staggering bloodshed. National cemeteries and monuments were erected, and the pain of loss was channeled into remembrance and reconciliation. The Gettysburg Address, spoken by President Abraham Lincoln at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in 1863, framed the war not just as a conflict for survival, but as a rebirth of the nation, a new birth of freedom, as Lincoln put it. Yet the stories of these battles remain complicated, marked by both heroism and tragedy. In modern-day America, these battlefields and memorials still stand as stark reminders of the immense sacrifices made. Visitors to Gettysburg, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and others witness the vastness of the loss, the open fields where men fought and died in unimaginable conditions. The quiet solemnity of these places invites us to pause and reflect, not just on history, but on the human cost of war and the enduring legacy of those who fought for their beliefs, regardless of the side they were on. But even as we honor those who were lost, we must also remember the lessons these battles impart: the importance of unity, the fragility of peace, and the need to ensure that such a devastating conflict is never repeated. The brutality of the Civil War and the unthinkable sacrifices made in these bloody battles continue to serve as a stark reminder of the price of freedom and the lengths to which people will go to defend it. The legacy of these battles remains, woven into the fabric of our national consciousness, in the memories of families, in the words of poets, in the echoes of war songs, and in the unbroken line of soldiers who fought for what they believed was worth the ultimate sacrifice. The lessons of Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, and the rest still resonate today, urging us to remember the cost of freedom and the value of peace. As we reflect on the brutal battles of the Civil War, we want to hear from you. Did your family have any connections to the war? Are there stories of ancestors who fought in these battles or perhaps were affected by them? Share your thoughts and family stories in the comments below. Let's continue this conversation about the past and its lasting impact on the present. If you found this video insightful, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update from our channel. We have more in-depth explorations of history, and we'd love for you to join us on this journey. Also, be sure to check out some of our related videos on the Civil War and other pivotal moments in American history. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.